because now we have a chance to deepen the themes you raised up in your speeches. Oh. My name is Maria Stenrus and I am the moderator of this discussion. Let's just go on from the NATO-EU cooperation. It was about a year ago when in Warsaw the cooperation was launched. Secretary General, how do you see the progress this far? And you mentioned about the next steps, so we are eager to hear what they could be.
The progress so far has been excellent, meaning that I think that if you have told anyone a year or two ago that we were able to achieve as much as we have achieved, I think not so many people would have been able to believe it. I think that one of the reasons why we have been able to reach or to achieve so much is partly that we have been very pragmatic and practical. And we have tried, because there are some sensitivities, there are some problems, or at least some challenges, partly because NATO and the EU, as Federica mentioned, we are two different organizations. To some extent, we have the same members. More than 90% of the people living in the EU, they live in a NATO country. But there are also some non-NATO EU members, and vice versa. And we have to show respect for them, their integrity, and also, of course, the independence and the decision-making processes of NATO and the EU. But I think we have been able to develop ways to do that with full respect of the EU, full respect of the NATO, and those states who are not members of both organizations at the same time, and then proving gradually that we are able to then make progress on hybrid, on cyber, on exercises, on many other, or working together in the Mediterranean or the Aegean Sea. Now we will just have to sit down again this fall and see how can we make sure that we implement all the 42 measures and then add some more to them. Exactly what we'll add, I don't know, but I guess there are some people in the room who are already working on that.
Mrs. Mogherini, we all remember the NATO boats on the Aegean Sea. It was one of the signs of the cooperation of EU and NATO. How do you see the progress? Are you happy about that?
Very much so, and I think, as Jens said, that we managed, first of all, to overcome, and if I can quote you, you said something very wise, I think, to one of the foreign ministers or defense ministers meeting of the European Union, because this is one of the practices we introduced. We regularly invite each other to our respective ministerial meetings, which is an excellent exercise in itself. You said once, we've managed to kill the ghosts of the past. And I think this is a very effective image. We managed to move from the ideology of the relations between NATO and the European Union. That has always been difficult because the nature of the two organizations is different. The European Union is a political union, NATO is a military alliance, and some of our members are not the same. But we took a very pragmatic approach, defining which are the needs, which are the fields where we need our cooperation in order to be effective, and how do we manage to deliver on this? So we took at the same time a very ambitious but also very pragmatic approach. And I think this is why we managed to build trust, overcome the suspicious on both sides. And I'm very satisfied because this is a cooperation that has proven to be real, practical, with real things done. Cooperation in the Mediterranean, the cyber, for the first time ever, sharing some of the practices of our exercises. And for me, the real challenge was to prove that it was possible to advance at the same time the EU-NATO cooperation and the EU defense policy. And here there is one particular thing that might come in our future agenda, which is the work on capabilities. In the European Union, we are increasing the work we're doing to help member states investing together on capabilities. I often say the real gap between Europeans and Americans is not so much how much Europeans invest in defense, but is the output. We invest 50% of what the Americans invest in defense in Europe, but the output we achieve is 15%. So the output gap is huge. The European Union can help the European Union member states to invest better in a less fragmented way on capabilities. And as member states have one single set of forces, however they manage to make the most out of their investments, this is going to be beneficial also obviously for European Union missions and operations, but also for NATO missions or for UN operations or for different kinds of security activities. So I think this can be one of the next fields of common work. It is already among the 42 actions already to be implemented, but as I am convinced that also thanks to the leading role of Finland, we will be able to launch a permanent structured cooperation within the European Union by the end of the year. This could be the next horizon to work on.
You both work in central positions in your organization and have a broad view on the security around us. Mrs. Mogherini, you wrote, it was the first year report of the EU global strategy. In that text you wrote that when...
This is always dangerous.
Yeah. 2016, when launching the strategy, the world was a different place. How do you see the changes? What has changed?
The global strategy says that the world is more complex and more unpredictable than ever, and I think this stays quite true. The complexity and the unpredictability, by definition, by themselves, produce new realities every time. And as Jens said, it's not the hybrid nature of the threats that is something new, but it's the mix, it's the speed, and it's the fact that actually the complexity makes it difficult even to identify the source of the threat sometimes. Something that looks sand is a bicycle. And that is the complexity we're facing. And I think the real change is the fact that it will continue to change and that we will have to adapt to an ever-changing security situation. That requires a different level of understanding, a different level of analysis. To me, the European way to security and also to foreign policy is potentially the answer to this kind of ever-changing security situation, which is investing in partnerships, investing in multilateralism, investing in cooperation, investing in a rules-based global order. At the end of the day, this is how the European Union was built. This is also how it prospered, even if sometimes we don't realize how much. And I believe this is the key also for facing this evolving situation. And the partnership with NATO is one of the key elements in this.
And if you look at the situation both worldwide and then the Baltic Sea, what do you see?
For NATO, the thing is that we have to, as the European Union, but in another way, we have to relate to a much more unpredictable world, uncertainty, and we need to relate to many different challenges at the same time. We need to relate and to respond to turmoil, violence in the south, North Africa, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan. We need to address the risks of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, especially nuclear weapons, North Korea. And we need to respond to a more assertive Russia. And of course, it's not new for NATO that we have to respond to different challenges, but I think we have to admit that before it was more one challenge, and then we had another challenge, and then we had yet another challenge. Now we have all at the same time on top of each other. Just to briefly remind you of the fact that for 40 years, from NATO was founded in 1949 to 1989, NATO actually did only one thing. We did collective defense in Europe. We didn't participate in any military missions, not in any military operations. We didn't fire a shot at all. We were just strong in Europe. Then the Cold War ended, the Berlin Wall came down, and people started to wonder, do we need NATO anymore? And they said, NATO has to either go out of area or out of business. And we went out of area because we went into the Balkans. And that, at that time, to go out of NATO territory into Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, was a big step. It was totally new. And then we helped to end 2 ethnic wars in the Balkans. And then we went to Afghanistan, which was even more strange in a way and something completely different. We did a lot of crisis management, fighting terrorism from the end of the Cold War until, let's say, 2014. Then suddenly we had Crimea. We had Russia destabilizing eastern Ukraine, illegally annexing Crimea. And we had ISIL and Mosul, Raqqa Daesh, all that close to our borders. So then we had to be able to do both collect the defense in Europe again, increase our military presence with, for instance, the battle groups in the Baltic countries, and at the same time step up the fight against terrorism, instability close to our borders. So now we have in a way to do, and then we have North Korea and all those threats. So for NATO, the world has changed in a way that we are now forced to respond to many different security challenges at the same time, while before it was more first Cold War, collective defense in Europe, then so stability, crisis management outside NATO territory. Now we have to do both at the same time, and that's a big deal. And therefore, it is important to do it together with the European Union.
Like a more complicated word all the time. You mentioned in your opening words the border crossings by bicycles in northern Norway. So that could be one example of hybrid threats. And now we are here in this opening ceremony of the center of Helsinki. How do you see what is the way to make resilience a more common word?
Let me say two things. First of all, the people that crossed the border up in north, they were not hybrid threats. They were desperate people coming into Norway and flying, also leaving also violence and poverty in other parts of the world. Second, the main challenge now is, of course, to make sure that we are responding all together. And that's exactly why we are working so hard, not only 29 NATO allies, but also together with the European Union and other partner nations.
How urgent do you see the need for deep understanding on hybrid threats? And what could these people here in Helsinki, how could they help this?
I think this is going to be crucial, not only because we are opening it today, but really not only because it showcases so well the good EU-NATO cooperation. Jens and I were looking for a visit to do together for quite some time, and finally we make it. But this is really the symbolism of something we are concretely doing together. But this is because it's not by chance that both Jens and I refer to this center as potentially a hub of excellences and competences, because there's a lot of work ongoing on hybrid. The nature of hybrid threats is requiring that there is a lot of work in different places from different expertises on this, on how to respond. But to have a center of excellence that can provide the network in the hub for joining, analyzing, providing a sort of catalyst and also multiplier of this work is quite invaluable, because the risk of complexity and the never-changing world and threats is the fragmentation of the response, is the fact that you don't have a unifying understanding of things. And the fragmentation, I think the President mentioned that, protecting our societies, protecting the cohesion of our societies is part of the resilience we can do. So having a hub here that gathers the excellence of the work done on hybrid and provides this coherence of work, I think is an excellent service to global security, not only to the security of Finnish people, of Europeans, of NATO allies, but also of the world in general. Because again, as Jens was saying, the threats move from purely military to also military, but also a lot of other things. And if you imagine that providing humanitarian support is part of the prevention of a threat in some cases, gives you the sense of the complexity of the things we have to do. So I think the center can really be a point of reference for the work we're all doing.
One more question about Finland, because Finland, here we always talk about this all-of-government approach. Is that something that could be exported, or is it something too complicated?
It's my dream. You know, when I started, I said I had a hearing in the European Parliament, and I said my dream would be not to have people working in different European Union institutions referring to one another as us and them, but just as us. And having this long, never-ending title, having this two hats of being Vice President of the Commission and High Representative, and also heading the European Defence Agency, so actually three hats. My dream is exactly that of bringing the coherence of the work together, a sort of whole of government approach in the European Union institutions, Council, Commission, and the different agencies. And I have to tell you, it works. Because when people realize that moving from sometimes internal competition, and I've been a minister myself, I know well, sometimes it's natural, but moving from internal competition to internal cooperation actually multiplies the effectiveness of your action. So it's smart, it saves a lot of time and energy that sometimes is spent in internal fights that could go into external action. And I believe this is really the key to do things and do things right. Obviously, the more complex an institution is, and the European Union, I guess, gets close to the maximum of that. United Nations probably can compete with us in complexity of structures. But the more complex an institution is, the more complicated it is to have an overall government approach. But I think Finland shows us the way and teaches us the good lesson of how good and important it is to do it. In NATO, for sure, it's easier because the nature of military structures streamlines a lot, but
yes,
that's your
even
job.
in NATO, I think we can learn something from Finland, and especially when it comes to working together across different responsibilities and different areas of work strands. And again, this relates to the hybrid thing, because before NATO could be focused on more military response in a narrow sense, meaning planes and tanks and warships and so on. But of course, with the terrorist threat and with the hybrid threat, we need also to be very focused on all the other elements, which is part of the defense of a country, the defense of the alliance, and the response to this huge variety of threats. For instance, resilience of infrastructure, resilience of our energy supply, of our roads, our healthcare, and all that. And that just highlights the need to work closer together with civilian authorities in the different member countries, but also work together with the European Union. And even when you speak about more traditional military issues, for instance, the importance of having high readiness forces, being able to reinforce if needed. For instance, the Baltic region, we need to be able to move forces across Europe. And the reality is that to be able to do that, we need harbors, we need railroads, we need air fields which are able to facilitate the movement of heavy military material. And again, close link between the purely military part of NATO's responsibilities and the rest, and then the work with the European Union.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.